Welcome to Resiliency Within. I'm your host, Elaine Miller-Karras. My show today is entitled Racial Tragedy and Intergenerational Resiliency and features the very personal story recounted by my guest, Phil Allen Jr., who I will introduce to all of you in a few moments. Amani Perry, a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, stated recently, "Human beings organize knowledge through storytelling. We create ourselves in light of the stories we hear and tell. Having stories that give us courage and inspiration are always necessary, but especially so when we face injustice." Phil Allen is a storyteller, recounting the truthful story of his grandfather, Nathanial Allen, through his documentary and book entitled Open Wounds, a story of racial tragedy, trauma, and redemption. Phil Allen Jr. is also the founder of the nonprofit, the Racial Solidarity Project. He is a speaker, a preacher, an author, a poet, a doctoral candidate at Fuller Theological Seminary, and a documentary film producer. And to use Phil's own words, he is driven towards racial justice as well as healing the trauma that is inflicted by racial tragedies and societal constructions that perpetuate racial inequities. It has been said that Open Wounds is a transformative experience of listening and learning as you, Phil Allen, the grandson of Nathaniel, looks, laments, and ultimately leads your family and society forward towards a just and reconciled future. It is an essential part of our national reckoning with racism and injustice. We commemorate your grandfather today as we remember his life and legacy. And we acknowledge Black History Month. And sadly, on December 10th, 1953, Nathaniel Allen was murdered on the Sanpete River in South Carolina by his white employer, who lured him into the meeting under the false promise of reconciliation. His death was recorded as an accidental drowning, but it was a deliberate cover-up of a bullet hole seen by more than one witness. And right now, it is my honor to introduce his grandson, Phil Allen Jr., to us. Phil, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure hanging out with you and talking with you.
Well, we've known each other for a little bit, so it's been an honor to be in your film. Actually, I have a little spot in it as well. But it's just we begin as I just even say the words about your grandfather. Is there anything that's on your mind that you'd like to say before we start with some of the kind of formal questions that we've prepared today?
As you introduced me when you said his grandson, because most of my life I've never been referred to in relationship to my grandfather. So that was really cool to hear. Not just because I did the documentary in the book, but it's like living out his legacy or continuing my grandfather's legacy, and for 40 plus years never even thought about it until I embarked on this journey. And so to hear you say we have with us today Nathaniel Allen's grandson, that's the kind of the first time I've ever heard someone say that.
Oh my goodness, I got chills all over me, all over my hands and arms when I've said it. So I'm so glad that we could acknowledge him.
Yeah.
And that we can hear more about, the story. So that brings me to my first question is, what inspired you to produce the film and write a book about the injustice of your grandfather's murder?
The first thing that comes to mind, the first thing I wanted to do was honor my grandfather's name. As I did the research and asked the question to find out what happened to him, and I saw on his death certificate, accidental drowning. And there was a time when I actually believed that may have been true, until I spoke with my grandmother. And once she confirmed that her father saw his body and saw the bullet hole, then that settled it for me. And so for me, I wanted to honor his name because he will forever be dishonored with that lie on his death certificate.
Yes.
And he's a veteran. He was a veteran, was willing to put his life on the line for this country during World War II. And they dishonored him.
Yes.
And so this story is about honoring my grandfather.
So I know that it's also about your grandmother. And if you could share a little bit about your experience with her, because I think she's part of this, a very big part of the story as well.
Absolutely. My grandmother, she raised me for a number of years in my life. I lived with both of my grandparents at different times. I lived with my parents for a period as well. But my grandmother, in my high school years, I lived with her, and I was close to all my grandparents. And I never understood why she was the way she was in terms of her temperament.
Hmm.
She could be tough to be around. She could be tough to to deal with. She was a tough lady. And doing the research and talking to her brothers shed light on so much for me. And I realized how much she carried that event with her the rest of her life.
So she suffered. She
Oh,
suffered. And she suffered did she suffer in silence? Did she share?
absolutely.
Yeah.
She never spoke to my father about his father until he was in his late 30s. She never spoke to her grandkids about our grandfather. And she would shun you if you tried to ask any questions about it. And you could see the visceral response. Her body would constrict. I talk about this in the book. Her body would constrict, tighten. Her face would tighten. You could see it, and I didn't understand that until I began to understand trauma and the implications of trauma on our bodies and our emotions, our minds that we can carry with us. And so,
If I could just pause for a second, because I think that's of course how we became acquainted, was you were seeking some answers about, well, how does trauma impact someone across generations? And one of the things that you're talking about, your grandmother being so constricted and tight, and how have you been, the whole program, the Resiliency Within, is about, what has helped you get through? What has sparked which I've seen so many times, Phil, your resiliency when you're faced this incredible tragedy of your family's story. And yet I see you so many times being so positive and touching into the suffering, but there's something more. And in fact, we've used the same line, like, what else is true? Could you talk a little bit about that with us?
yeah, I think um, being one generation removed from my grandfather and the event spared me some of that trauma. Um, my father said he prayed over me when I was in my mother's womb, and I really believe that was significant. And I've seen all the things that have happened over the course of my life, so I know that there's grace, that there's God's hand is on my life. I understand that, and so I have the space to be able to do the research to go down this road. But I think more importantly, seeing how strong my grandmother was and all that she accomplished in her life, um, that fired me up. That motivated me. It's almost like I have to do something to honor my grandfather, to do what my grandmother couldn't do. So I learned a lot of that from her, from my grandparents.
Well, it's almost like you're honoring your grandmother at the same time. Can we hear, what was her name?
Rebecca Young.
Rebecca. Okay, Rebecca.
Yeah.
So you're also honoring her because as she suffered and she kept silent, but then she decided to start to speak about your grandfather. So what happened that caused that to start to occur?
I ask that question all the time. And I won't ever get an answer because the first time she didn't want to talk about it, but about 9 months before she passed, my uncle, one of my dad's older brothers, he was in the nursing home and he couldn't speak, he couldn't move. He died of complications of CTE from playing football, college and professionally. And I don't know if that affected her and she wanted to just share, but she was in a very vulnerable place. And so I asked her again, and this time she was willing to share. And I don't know if she felt like she was coming near the end of her life and she needed to get it off her chest. I don't know, but she began to talk about it. That was the only conversation we ever had. And she passed.
Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say she passed away about 9 months later.
And so you were able to take that bit of information that she gave you, along with, I know you've done a lot of discovery about what happened to your grandfather. If you'd like to tell us a little bit more about your journey.
Yeah, I went to Sundance Film Festival 2 years ago, and watching a film and seeing that some of the details in the film reminded me of the details in my grandfather's story. And so I went back to a forum. I was there with Windrider Productions. They do a forums at Sundance for Christian colleges and schools, but not only Christian colleges. They'll have universities there as well. Filmmakers, people who are interested in the arts and film will come as a class. So I was taking a class. I never thought I'd be taking a class at Sundance doing a PhD program, but I was doing that. And I shared in the forum after a young man saw the same movie, and he said, I don't really know anybody that's ever been lynched. I don't have that experience. He was from Seattle, I think, Washington State. And he talked about the technical aspect of the film, but the film had touched me deeply. So I began to share my grandfather's story. It was then that people started to say to me, you have got to tell this story.
Wow.
I never set out to do a film, maybe write a book, but not do a film. I called my friend L. Michael Lee, who directed my film, and we talked briefly on the phone and decided we'd do it. And in 6 months, we were able to go back to South Carolina and interview and ask questions and go to locations I had never been. There were 3 locations I'd never been. I'd never been to my grandfather's grave. I'd never been to the last place where he was alive before he got in the boat to go to that small island where he was killed. I'd never been to, there's a monument with a list of the seamen who died on at sea. His name is on that monument. So I was able to I felt closer to my grandfather.
So what was that like? I mean, the emotional experience of really retracing the footsteps of your grandfather, knowing that he had been murdered at the same time.
Yeah, it was a constant back and forth, up and down, I should say. So I felt excited to see these locations, see his name, see his gravesite, but then I felt grief at the same time because it was almost like I'd never felt that close to my grandfather, and I wanted to hear his voice now. I wanted to speak with him now, and couldn't. So it was this constant up and down with me during that season. And it was about getting closure, getting some sort of closure for myself and my family.
Well, so, some people have shared with me sometimes when they've had these kinds of experiences, they almost feel like the spirit of the person who's passed becomes so apparent with them. It's almost like they're speaking to them. Did you have any experiences like that? And if you did, can you share those with us?
No, I didn't really have that profound of an experience. I just felt a sense of closeness to my grandfather.
Ah, okay.
Maybe I'm describing the same thing, but I didn't
Yeah,
feel,
that closeness.
yeah, I did feel at his gravesite, especially, I felt like if I turned around, he would be walking up behind me or
Yeah,
something
that's
saying, hey,
exactly what I'm talking about. Right. So you could sense him.
yeah.
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 And for those of you that are listening to us, there's a big smile on Phil's face when he said that he could hear that. Yes. So, I'm curious too now about talking about other family members. I mean, how your siblings were impacted, but also just curious about your dad. So how has this journey impacted your father and your relationship with your dad?
Great question. I think it's been a blessing to my dad. I've never heard him talk about his father to me until a few years before I made the film. We had a conversation, and his doctor was saying that or therapist was saying that he was depressed because of the death of his mother and his brother. And I said to him, do you think that your still grieve. He said he was still grieving. And I said, do you think you're still grieving your father's death? And he said, well, I never knew my dad. And I said, that's my point.
Yeah.
And he had never thought about it. He said, you may be onto something. So as we began to do this film, I would talk to him about his dad. I would share things that I found out. I probably know more about his dad than he does.
And how old was he when his dad was murdered?
2 years old.
2 years old. Okay.
So he never knew his father. He
Yeah.
found out at 9 how his father was killed.
And you think
And
that was a pivotal time in your, so what happened when he was 9 then? What happened when he learned that information?
my grandmother told me when my father found out, from that point on, he was an angry person. And my dad admitted that he fought all the time. He looked to fight. He looked to fight white boys his age as he grew. If they were his age, if they were anywhere in sight, he would start a fight with them. And my dad was known as a fighter. My dad was known, like, you don't mess with him. And he did that until I was born, until I was conceived. And so he was this angry person. And then he began to take it out on my mom during the course of their marriage. And that's what I grew up in. That's the dad that I knew.
And that's that intergenerational trauma that we're talking about. What happens when things are not witnessed, when the truth isn't told, or when it's been shrouded, and when there's been the horrible murder that was said to the world that it was an accidental drowning. Yep. So you don't get to really know what happened. So there's just this mystery and shroudedness that happens. So how do you think this has impacted your dad, that you're talking about his father? You've learned about his dad. What's happened with that?
Since we've been, over the last couple of years, since we've been having these conversations, I could sense on the phone, because my dad lives in Minnesota. I could sense on the phone that he's lighting up. He lights up. As I share things with him, or as he talks about his dad, he lights up. As I share people's response to the film, people's response to the book, he lights up. I honestly believe that it's brought healing to my dad. My dad struggled for decades with substance abuse, and he's been sober for a number of years now. So he's doing well. And I believe coinciding with that has been the telling of his father's story. And I believe that it's brought some healing, and it's actually brought us closer, because we've never really had this type of relationship in my life.
Well, I think that comes to my next question. What does redemption look like for you personally, and for your family collectively, as you share this with us?
I think healing first, when you tell the truth. Yeah. So when that death certificate says accidental drowning, a narrative was created. A false narrative was created. And there are even people my grandfather's age, in their 80s and 90s, they believe, Black people back home, when you ask about my grandfather, they'll say, oh yeah, he drowned in the Sanpete River. And then I have to correct them and say, well, no, he didn't drown. He was killed. And they didn't, so they bought the narrative.
Yes.
They bought into it. And so now I'm rewriting the narrative. I'm doing the investigating, doing the research. Like I said, my great grandfather saw his body. The funeral director couldn't say anything, or something would have happened to him. And we have people who shared in the film that they had conversations with the funeral director. They had a connection there. And then
is there any chance that now that this truth is coming out, that they can change the death certificate, that the governmental officials of that part of South Carolina could say, we were wrong, we can change this, or not? What's been their reaction to the film? Do they know about the film, first of all? And if they do know about it, have they reached out to you in any way?
No, I don't know if they know anything about the film. I haven't reached out to them. My father said my grandmother tried to get the case reopened maybe 15 years ago. and they rejected it. They wouldn't do that. I think the only option would be if we were to exhume his body, and if we were to either find a bullet in there or some sign of a bullet,
that might
that he
change.
was
I mean,
shot.
would that be important to you if that could happen or not? I mean, I know that the journey maybe it's not, you're shaking your head, so it's
No,
not that important to you.
no, I wouldn't want to do that. It would be up to my father and his brother, and I know they wouldn't want to do that. I think knowing the stories from my grandmother, from my father, from my uncle, and then the man, apparently in his later years before he passed, he admitted that he did,
Oh, he did.
yeah, to someone, and I can't really share. They asked me not to, but they said that this man admitted to them. So that's enough for me.
Mhm.
Um, I always wondered if 10 years, 20 years after my dad and uncle maybe passed away, if I would, as the oldest grandchild, if I would do that. And I don't think I would.
Yeah. So,
Um,
I guess it's also it's you're on a journey, and sometimes we don't know, where we're going to. It's the journey is the journey. We don't know where we're going to end up. So
yeah,
you don't have to make that decision right now. Plus, it's not yours to make. It sounds like it would be your dad and your uncle's.
yeah.
That comes to the next question is that, what can others in our country learn about the effects of racism and um, I guess the availability of kind of the resiliency that you're sharing with us, even that decision about, I don't need to do that. Can you let us, what are your thoughts about that, Phil?
I think when it comes to racism, I think what frustrates me the most is when people say, can we forget about the past and move on? And that's a dangerous suggestion. And when it comes to Black folks, the Black community, it's the only group that people will say that about. Because we never say that in regards to, say, the Holocaust, and
Mm-hmm.
we shouldn't.
No.
I was there at Auschwitz. I visited Auschwitz a couple of times, and it's sobering. It's like a long funeral the whole time you're there. You're
Yes.
grieving. I can't imagine what those.
Yeah, I haven't been to Auschwitz, but I've been to Dachau, and I know the experience of that. I mean, and I
Yeah.
think part of the motto is that we'll never forget.
Yes,
Yes.
and so the same is true for us. We're living out the legacy of the past, not just slavery, but Jim Crow era. Their families, since I've done this film, there have been many families that have come to me, emailed me, or said to me after a showing, the same thing happened to my uncle, my dad, my grandfather, my cousin, the same thing. And my family just never talked about it. So we're carrying the trauma for generations. And so when people think about the response to, say, the video of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, the news of Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin, we're not responding to just one individual event. We're responding to another one in the
Yes.
lineage.
Yes.
So it's not, let's forget about the past. How can you forget about something that still continues?
Well, and I think that's the what I've been pondering is that it's not over. That's what you're saying. I mean, it's not the past. It's the past that and how the past creeps into the present and all the suffering that continues. And so, and that's, so how do you think, how do we change this? I've seen so much divisiveness in this country, and you've lived with it, your families live with it, and I think there's been an amplification of divisiveness over the last 5 years. And I think we have some opportunities to see how can we come together. What are your thoughts about how do we do this? I mean, it's kind of a big question, but I think, if we can start the dialogue, we can maybe do something differently in the future and change some of that institutional, the structures that, were developed long before we were born, and
Yeah.
yet we're all affected by them now. So what are your thoughts about that?
I think there's no one way. I think there are multiple ways of doing it, and they have to come together. But I think just like what I'm doing with my film, um, I'm taking back the narrative and telling the truth. And so textbooks don't have the whole picture. Um, history is not told from Black and brown perspective, right? And so I
And that's
think,
why Black History Month is so important, but it really should be every month. It shouldn't
yeah,
just only be February, right? It should
yes,
be every month, because if we only tell the stories from one perspective, we're never going to get the narrative. And if the narrative has come from untruths, how can we know what really happened? So
exactly.
yeah, so continue. Yes.
So I think starting that's a good starting point. Is we have to teach people this is what actually happened. I
Yes.
know people who say slavery wasn't that bad.
What?
I've heard people,
You've heard people say
I've
that?
heard white folks say, well, slavery wasn't that bad because they at least had a place to stay, they had food, they had. So that
Well,
tells me
that's
they are not familiar with what actually happened,
no. How could they be?
right? Or the fact that these people were considered property. And so this idea of listen, learn, lament, labor is something I came up with in a class after an
Listen,
experience.
learn,
Learn, lament,
lament,
labor.
labor. Those 4 terms. Okay.
So the listen, learn piece, I've heard everyone saying that. But that really has to be about listening to our stories, but also sitting under teachers, professors, um, leaders, theologians, what have you, and learning of color, of Black folks, and learning from them,
Yes.
listening and learning. And then the other part is from there should be lament. There should be grieving, but we don't sit still enough. We don't listen and learn outside of the dominant perspective, the dominant narrative, to even give ourselves a chance to lament.
Well, and when you tell me about your grandma and how she held her body so tight, whether she was given the space to really grieve and lament for what had happened to your grandfather. But if that can happen, if that expression of grief, which we know it can be so healing, how could that impact what we're talking about right now? It's important, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I share with a lot of my white brothers and sisters that if you take the time to hear our stories, lament in that, grieve in that with me, I'm betting that there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity for you to see yourself in me.
Right. And so what
Because
happens? What happens when we can see ourselves in another person? What happens?
empathy.
Empathy, compassion.
Empathy happens, compassion happens, righteous indignation happens.
Yes.
But the scary part is it's going to cause you to have to review your worldview.
And you have to have a new narrative, right? It has to be a new narrative because it has to say, oh, just don't get over it, right? It
Yep.
has to say, of course, how can you do that? Because it is living right now within us, amongst
Yep.
us.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get ready for a little bit of a break. And I want to let people know that when we come back from this break, Phil's going to continue to talk with us about his reflections, about how we can, even more so than what we've talked about so far, how can we really try to look at this issue of racism and how we can come together. We only heard the lament. We need to hear about the labor part. And I think that's probably labor and work, right? Because it takes work.
Yep.
And
Yep.
it also takes discussion and not being silent.
Yep.
So, and it can be uncomfortable to talk about this, right? Because I
Absolutely.
know that we talk about white fragility, about, oh, I don't know, I don't want to say anything that could harm you, to hurt you. Well, of course, I don't want to do that. But then if we don't talk about it, how do I know?
Yep.
So we have to have the conversations. And so that's what we will continue to do, after the break. And I'm so excited. I want to say this before the break, and I'm going to say it afterwards, that your book, Open Wounds, is launched right tomorrow, February
Tomorrow.
9th,
Yes.
2021. So I feel so
Yes.
honored that we're talking to you on February 8th. I want you to know that I went to Amazon this morning and I bought it. It's going to be delivered to my house tomorrow. So
Awesome.
I've seen your film, of course, but I'm really interested in seeing the deeper reflections that I know that you will bring out in the book. So
Thank you.
please, everybody, go to your Amazon.com or wherever else, and you'll give us more information and get Open Wounds, and you can hear more about the deep reflections of this wonderful man, Phil Allen. the
Thank you.
grandson of Nathaniel. And with that, we'll take our break and we'll be back in a couple minutes.
All right, great job. We're all clear. Real quick, I've been hearing some interference
I
coming
have
through
been
on some
hearing some
lines.
too. So
Yeah,
where is that coming from?
It could just be something going on the lines, but oftentimes it's if you have a cell phone near your computer or your computer speakers or something like that, sometimes when it's receiving information wirelessly, it'll cause that, you'll hear that noise. So if you have a cell phone nearby all your equipment there, go ahead and move it in case that's what it is.
I'll move it because it comes in and out.
Yeah.
Buzzing. I have a cell phone that I'll put on the floor. It's on the floor.
I still can't see it live on
Can
your
you
page.
hear? It's still, yeah. It says it's live on Facebook on my thing, so I'm not sure what's happening with that.
Yeah, it's showing live on Facebook on the Zoom call.
Might be your link. I am going to, yes. Hello, everybody on Facebook. We're sitting here trying to figure out the sound. So here we are. Is that better now, Matt? The sound?
Yeah, well, I haven't heard it during the break yet, but we'll see if we hear it again. But yeah, as long as you move the cell phone, if that's what it is, then that'll fix it. But if not, then we might hear it again. I'm not sure.
Okay, we'll see. Yeah, because I haven't had that happen before.
Can you share it on your personal page? And maybe I can share it from there.
Oh goodness, now that I've thrown my phone away, I have no way to get in touch with my production assistant. Hold on. Well, he might be listening. So what would you like to do, Phil? You need something.
I'm just trying to figure out how to get to see it so I can share it.
Okay, so I'm gonna send you an email. How's that?
Because I just can't
get to it. Okay, let's see.
I was paged.
Yes. Oh yes. He said he can't see the resiliency within. Are you seeing it? Is on the Facebook page, can you see the resiliency within?
Yeah, it's going through now. It was frozen for a second.
It was frozen for a second, Phil, so maybe it's going to be okay now. Hey, John.
Yes.
Can you pick up that phone for me on the ground?
Sure.
Nope, still don't see it.
And can you take that other phone out of the room? Because I think that could have been the culprit of causing the interference.
Yeah, there was some sort of staticky. I could tell when you heard it because you'd adjust your mic.
I was trying to think if it was happening, if this was happening, but now I haven't heard it again. So, okay.
Yeah, I don't see it. I don't know what's going on.
He doesn't see it for some reason. Phil doesn't see it.
What is he not seeing?
He's not seeing the resiliency with the Facebook Live.
I just had to reboot my Facebook page. I don't know if
you reboot your Facebook page.
Let me go back down and take a.
He's going to try to see what he can do, Phil.
Okay.
And if you're still listening, we're doing trying to figure out what's going on, Facebook listeners, because you might be still seeing us. We're trying to see if there's some glitches happening right now. We're going to be coming back live on Voice America in just a few minutes. And we'll try to see at the end if Phil can be on the Facebook page at the end if there's questions that we might be able to answer then. And Matt will let us know when we're coming back.
All right. Yeah, we are coming back here. We got about 10 seconds and we'll come back.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm on my computer and still don't see it.
Your network. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
On our end, fills up. Everything's broadcasting the way it should.
Okay.
This is Resiliency Within with Elaine Miller-Karras. To reach the show during our live broadcast, please call in to 1-866-472-5792. That's 1-866-472-5792. You may also send an email to elaine@resiliencywithin.com. Now, back to this week's show.
This is Elaine Miller-Karras, and I'm here with Phil Allen, and we've been talking about his documentary, Open Wounds, and his book, Open Wounds, that will be released tomorrow. And we've been talking about his grandfather, Nathaniel, who was murdered, sadly, in 1953 in South Carolina. And we're talking about how can we be less divisive in our country? What are some of the ways that we can move forward in changing the dialogue, changing the narrative? And Phil, can you share with us again your 4 L's? And I think if we can maybe dive into the labor part, or anything else you want to say about the other L's, I'm going to turn it back over to you. So,
Yeah, if I can give some background as to how I came up with that.
Yeah, please.
I was in a class called Theology and Ethics of Martin Luther King Jr. And we were watching a film, Eyes on the Prize. You can see it on YouTube. The whole document, it's a PBS series. It's great. And a picture of Emmett Till was on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
And for the first time, I realized I can't look at Emmett Till without seeing my grandfather, because his body would have.
Right. Can you say a little bit about, there might be people that don't know about Emmett Till. So say a little bit about him before you continue.
Emmett Till was a 14-year-old kid from Chicago. He was visiting family in Money, Mississippi. And he was accused of whistling or saying, "Hey, baby," to a white woman in the store where he was buying some, I guess, candy or something, which turned out to be a lie. She later admitted decades later. But the woman's husband and brother came looking for him, found him at his grandfather's house, took him out of the house, tied something around his neck, threw it in the ocean, and he drowned. And I think they may have shot him as well, but he drowned. And then his body was found later. And so it reminded me, and also
Yes.
his mother wanted to make sure the world knew or saw what they did to her son. So she had an open casket, and they took a picture of it, and it was in the Jet magazine. So the world has seen that picture. So when I saw the picture, and I'd seen it growing up, but this was the first time I actually thought about my grandfather. So I shared that in class with 2 classmates. We had broken up in small groups to reflect. And when I shared what happened to them, they began to have tears began to fall. That was the first time I'd ever experienced where white folks responded emotionally to Black tragedy. I'd never experienced that before.
And so what happened to you when you saw their tears? What was your reflection?
It was healing for me. I needed to see that they actually cared, that it wasn't an intellectual exercise we were doing watching that film, that it was real. I shared it with the rest of the class, and more people, tears were flowing. And so right then I wrote down, listen, learn, lament, labor over the rest of that class, because they were in a position of listening to my story. They were in a context of learning. They were learning from Dr. Hak-Jun Lee, who is a Korean MLK scholar, an ethics scholar. So they were listening to him, learning from him about Martin Luther King Jr. These are white students, classmates. And then they were lamenting. Yes. So they went from intellectual exercise, watching a video on screen and talking about it, like a history lesson, to this is real, because here's a classmate whose grandfather experienced something very similar. So they're lamenting, they're grieving. And one young man said, as you see your grandfather in Emmett Till, I'm seeing my grandfather in the man who killed him.
Oh, wow.
And I guarantee you he'd never thought about that before.
No, so at that moment, the interchange between the two of you, then what happened next? What was the conversation like? Wow.
Well, he was trying to speak through tears because he shared with the rest of the class as well. And I just felt like it was a microcosm or a model of what should be happening more broadly. The acknowledgement of what happens to my grandfather and more broadly Black people historically and currently, but also what is it causing you to think about?
And so
he
how
wasn't. Go ahead.
and how do we recreate those moments? I mean, this was a class where you had this opportunity to lament together. So when we're thinking about society at large, how, I mean, maybe through your book and through your documentary, but how do we do that? How do we create those moments? I mean, that to me is one of the most important things.
I think in one sense, you build your library. That's one way you can very easily begin to listen and learn from people of color, particularly Black folks. You can watch film. You have friends where you don't want to put the pressure on them to have to keep talking about stuff without you actually doing some work as well. But putting yourself in position, and when I say yourself, I'm talking about white folks, because typically the white community doesn't have to put themselves in that situation. So being at a church where there's a Black pastor preaching and teaching, taking classes in school from teachers of color, sitting in contexts where you're uncomfortable.
So choosing not to be in your silo, choosing not to be in the silo, to open that up. Yes.
Absolutely. So, so for me, I almost have to be, as Black and brown folks, we have to be. We have to go to work. We have to go to school. We likely have to come out of our communities into the dominant group.
Oh, this is so interesting, because I was reading something about one of the legislators, and I can't remember which one, but who was in the horrible thing that happened on January 6th, the insurgency. And his thought was, oh, I'm going to, he was a white legislator. And I goes, well, I'm just going to kind of go in with the Republicans and maybe I'll be okay. And then all of a sudden the thought came that was a privilege and an advantage, and that his friends who were also legislators that were people of color couldn't do that. And the legislator said, and I'm so sad that I can't remember the person's name, but that he learned about his privilege in such a visceral way that he had never understood before. And this is what you're talking about.
Yep. Yeah. And so it's choosing, and I'm encouraged by the ones that do. I'm discouraged by the many that don't or won't. Yeah. They would rather fight, dismiss, discount, rather than actually be quiet and listen, because our stories, past and present, are real, and they actually tell a greater narrative.
And so when you talk about the labor part, now I know you've started a nonprofit. So is the mission of the nonprofit to be the labor part, to do these? Okay, so you need to tell us about that, because we need to know about the nonprofit. And tell the name again. I've already mentioned it, but it would be nice to hear it in your voice.
So Racial Solidarity Project, that incident actually kind of inspired Racial Solidarity Project. And one of the areas, it's just 4 areas of activism that we want to be a part of. One is justice advocacy, and that can be done in different ways. It's not just protesting and petitioning and writing your congressmen and women, but it's also addressing issues of inequity in our society, being active in that. And we're just getting started. So this is in the planning stages.
This is a really important subject. I think many people don't know the difference between inequity and inequality. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it's so important that we know the difference.
Yeah. And so when we think about equality, we're thinking about status. So I don't need someone to tell me we're equal. I already know that. Equity comes into play when we're talking about how structures and systems have been in place that have caused advantages and disadvantages according to race.
Yes.
And so some people have access to things more readily. Some people are more insulated from things.
And so just like if we take something like education, we can say, oh, all children in the United States have equal access to education, but are all educational systems equitable?
Not at all.
No,
and we can start with funding. So last time I researched, there's a $23 billion gap between predominantly white schools and predominantly schools of color, Black and brown. Now, yes, it's based a lot of that is based on property value. Well, then why is there a disparity in property value? Now we got to go back into redlining.
Right.
and the legacy of redlining and how it's caused decline in the Black community when you withhold resources for so long. And the only time resources come back into the community is to gentrify,
Right. And
which
so
then
that's
dislocates.
and those are systems and structures where policy is really done that actually benefits one group and makes another group disadvantaged.
Yes.
Yeah. And so if we change that.
Well, we have to undo that. And that's not an overnight thing, but that needs to be undone. It needs to be taken seriously. But even without the if we go step away from the funding from property, from taxes, even the money that's given from the states and federal or from the states is still it's only about a $300 difference between the two, the schools of color and white schools per student. And that's a $300 more for schools of color, student per student at schools of color. But that's only a $300 difference when there's already a $23 billion gap. So where is the need?
Right.
So why not invest more?
Right. And, I think that we've been seeing that too play out with the pandemic, because I think with the pandemic, and we saw it in very concrete ways when children didn't have access to internet because their families couldn't afford internet in their buildings.
Yes.
So you can give a child, for example, all kids get iPads, but can you all use the iPad?
Yes.
So that's a very simple
equality and equity. All kids get laptops.
Yes, but not all kids can use the laptops.
But not all kids can use the laptops because of the structures and how they have constructed, for lack of a better term, the various the different communities.
And so your nonprofit, how will your nonprofit then be involved in these kinds of discussions? How will you be bringing people together?
Well, that's one area. The other area of activism is in education. And so this is where I want to provide these workshops or training in these spaces where we can teach the stuff that you and I are talking about now, from the history, the systems and structures, the inequities, what have you, and hearing the stories as well, creating those spaces. Then there's the wellness piece. And this is where addressing trauma comes into. I think that's a form of activism.
Well, and we have something in common because you know that I'm the developer of the community resiliency model, and you've become recently a community resiliency model teacher. Now, why have you decided to do that? That was a choice that you made after we got to know each other. But how does that fit into what you're planning to do?
I think after doing the film, thinking about my grandmother, thinking about my dad, and even myself, that's a part of the equation I think was overlooked. That we want to address the systems and structures. We want to fight. We want to resist. But in the meantime, we're not well.
Right.
We're tired. We're beaten. We're broken. We're wounded. And so if that is not addressed.
Right. And that's where the trauma informed, but the resiliency informed that you and I both believe in, right? So how do we stabilize ourselves in our hearts, our minds, our body, our thoughts, if we are doing work that the very nature of it, when we hear stories like your grandfather's, like Emmett Till's, that how could that not impact us as we hear the stories? And if you're a person of color, why? And we see in the news every single day someone being killed for just being someplace where someone didn't like the way they looked and something happened to them, right? So how do we show up as our best selves and not be in a place of fear constantly?
Absolutely.
So that is part of what you have brought into your thinking.
That's one of the four forms of activism.
Okay.
And then the last piece is community building. Because while we may fight for justice, then what?
Right.
If we don't build the community, and this is drawn from Dr. King's idea of the beloved community, the great world house. If we don't go that far, we're gonna have to come back around a generation later and fight for against more injustices because we never built the community. We never went that far.
And so, of course, what Martin Luther King did, and at that time in the civil rights movement, We know, you and I both know Rena Evers, Medgar Evers' daughter. We know that she continues to work in that way, but it's not done. And I think there might have been some folks out there that would have thought, oh, well, we already had that civil rights movement.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard people say that, but it's not done. And so this is I don't know how we would call it, but I think that the death of George Floyd opened up something, I think, in our country. It wasn't kind of like, oh, this really is happening, this awareness. Can you talk a little bit about that connection and how this is all intersecting?
Yeah, I think what happened with George Floyd, for most Black people that I know, it was not a surprise. It was shocking to see, but it was not a surprise. And if it's something like that, obviously not being shot, but if you didn't come close to that, many Black people I know, including myself, have had one or more incidents with law enforcement over the course of their lives.
Yes.
To this day, when I'm driving, if I ride past a police officer, my body responds.
Right. So do you get, like your grandma, do you get stiff? Yes.
I get nervous.
Yeah. Anxious.
Not as bad as it used to, but because of multiple experiences in my 20s, my body remembers that. Yeah. There are many African Americans who have that same experience, that same response. So for a lot of white Americans, a lot of my white friends, this was like, oh my goodness, what's going on? And we're saying, we were trying to tell you, this is a reality.
Right.
We can go back to I just wrote a paper on the use of the camera. Yes. How vital the camera has been to the Black experience from Dr. King on. If it were not for the camera,
right.
If it were not for the camera, would the civil rights movement have been as effective?
And so here you are now, a filmmaker, and you have been very impacted by going on this path of writing, filmmaking, being a student of theology. And this is all coming together in your life right now to help this awareness expand. So
absolutely.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about this. And I know we shared some questions, but what have you personally learned about yourself as you reflect on this journey, as we're getting ready to end our journey together today? Is there, what would you like to say to us that you want to really leave our listeners with?
I want to go back to what you always talk about, the resiliency. I don't know if we realize how resilient we are. I know in my community, we talk about trauma, but we also talk about how resilient our ancestors were. 246 years of slavery, 12 years of Reconstruction, 90 years of Jim Crow, into the civil rights movement, continuing to this day, and we're still here. And we're still fighting the era of Black Lives Matter movement. There's a resiliency that I didn't know I had until I did this film. And I've cried, and I've been angry, I've been confused, I've been dazed, and I've been excited in this whole process. And so I invite people to engage, because we talk about white fragility. Black people are not trying to take over. We're not trying to do harm. We want equity.
Yeah.
Right? If you look at our culture historically, we're some of the most hospitable people you'll ever meet. If you would trust enough to engage, you will see how resilient.
And like you engaged in that class.
Yes.
Yes. So that kind of engagement changed you, and it changed your colleagues, your fellow classmates. And you believe, I think what you're saying is that this can be replicated all over the country and the world.
Yes, this is the labor. This is part of the labor.
But there's also an acknowledgement that I'm also hearing that's important, that every person of color, remember, is about your resilience. That as much as there's been trauma and sadness, lament, suffering, there's also been an incredible resilience. And can you sense that resilience inside of you? I was going to ask that question, right?
Absolutely.
Can you sense that?
As I talk about it, I could sense it in my body.
Yeah,
as I
there's an
talk
energy
about
that
it.
I'm seeing in
Yes.
him. I know that you can't, but I can, maybe you can hear it in his voice. So, I often say these words about like, what else is true? Um, is that, can you tell me what else is true about all the things that we've been talking about today?
I think that may be it.
Okay.
That may be it. The resiliency is true as well. The resiliency, we talk about intergenerational trauma. Well, there's
Yes.
intergenerational resiliency.
Yes.
That
Intergenerational.
also is true.
And let's remember that is true. And so can you tell us, the listeners, if they want to get a hold of you, how do they get a hold of you?
On social media, everything is Phil Allen Jr.
Okay.
Instagram, you add an IG to it, but
Okay.
Facebook and Twitter is at Phil Allen Jr. You can email me, Phil at thersp.org, thersp.org. Those are the ways you can get in touch. Social media is pretty easy.
And how about
well.
if they wanted to see your movie, if they wanted to see your documentary, how could they find out about showings of the documentary?
You can go to philallenjr.com for any updates on me. That's another place way to see it, to keep up with me. But openwoundsdoc.com, which is also connected to the website. It's on the website, Phil Allen Jr.
Great.
Openwoundsdoc.com is where you'll see the video. It'll follow the instructions to watch the film. And then the book is on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, or Fortress Press.
Okay. So you have many ways to get in touch with Phil. Phil, I just want to say to you, every time we have a conversation, I am inspired. And I'm inspired about really your hope and your courage of bringing this story forward, because I know it's not always easy. And so I want to just remind everyone to please buy his book. I want everybody to read your book. And also want to share with everybody that my guest next week will be Rena Evers Everett, the daughter of Medgar Evers. And she will tell a little bit of her story and the amazing work that she does as the executive director of the Medgar and Marilee Evers Institute in Jackson, Mississippi. And I just want to say one more word to all of our listeners. Some of you may be feel unsettled by some of the things that we've talked about today. Maybe you feel inspired as well, but I want you all to remember what else is true in your life. If there's a moment when life is, derailing you, just as we've seen the resiliency in dear Phil Allen and his family, I want to add, I know that exists in all of you as well. So we will see you next week, same time, same station. This is Elaine Miller-Karras signing off for the day from Resiliency Within. Thank you again, Phil.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. Awesome job today. Good show. We're all clear.
Thank you. All right. I believe that we are still on Facebook. So I don't know if there's anything you want to say, because my production assistant says we're on, even though I know you've had some problems with it. So anything more you'd like to say, Phil, as we end our time together today?
Well, I would say the listen, learn, lament, I call that soul work.
Yeah,
that's the inner work.
Listen, learn, lament, and labor.
And that should happen before you do the labor, or as you're doing the labor, you should do the soul work, the listen, learn, lament. What's implied in that whole process, listen, learn, lament, labor, is love. I had a group, a high school, they added love to that. And that's fine, that's great. But love is implied in that. My classmates embodied love the day that they.
And do you talk about this your L's in the book?
Yes.
You bring this out, because I think this is a really important concept that we actually never talked about before together. And I want to learn more about it and talk more about it, because I think that bringing that paradigm into the dialogue is the very thing that needs to happen to help with that divisiveness that we've been experiencing. Because every time I talk to you, Phil, I always just feel such love for you and the work that you're doing. From the first moment that you came to my house and took pictures of all my photographs and paintings, and I have a house that's full of art from my my travels of going to disasters all over the world. And anyway, I have sweet gratitude tears in my eyes when I think about you. So I am so
Thank you.
grateful that you're on the planet and that you're spreading these words.
And I feel that love. I feel that love from you.
Wow.
Thank you.
Well, so, and if you have questions for Phil, you now know how to get a hold of him. And I think we can sign off unless there's anything more you want to say.
That's it. Get the book.
All
Where is
right.
it? Where is it?
Mine's coming tomorrow. I can't wait.
Oh, there it is. There it is behind me. Open Wounds.
Open Wounds.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks so
Thank
much.